is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. When Betsy DeVos was confirmed as the nation's Secretary of Education in 2017, there weren't many people betting she would stick around long. But contrary to those predictions, she is now one of the longest-serving members of President Trump's cabinet. Rebecca Klein of the Huffington Post talked with dozens of people for an in-depth analysis of DeVos's tenure so far, and she's here to discuss what she learned. Rebecca, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thank you so much for having me. I love this podcast.
We're always glad to hear that. So there have been plenty of profiles of Betsy DeVos in the nearly 3 years since she was confirmed. Beyond the upcoming anniversary date, why did you want to tackle this now?
Obviously, so much has changed since Betsy DeVos was first confirmed. At that time, she was barely confirmed to her position. But since then, we've seen so many cabinet secretaries and officials get fired or resign. And in the past few months, I've seen a lot of people on Twitter and the internet express a lot of shock that DeVos has made it thus far, given how unpopular she is and what a firestorm her confirmation was. And I personally, from covering her now for a few years, I'm not at all surprised that she's lasted this long. So I thought it would be a good time to reflect on that, as now there's only just, I think, less than a handful of cabinet secretaries from the original administration that have made it this far.
What do you base that on? I mean, is it just that she's managed to avoid sort of these overt controversies, although certainly some of her decisions have been controversial?
Something that, a few people emphasize is that perhaps unlike other cabinet secretaries, she didn't get into this job to be famous. She's not a big self-promoter. She doesn't want to step on Trump's toes. She's happy just to stay out of the limelight as much as she can and enact her agenda, which she's deeply dedicated to. And by that token, she didn't necessarily come in with ulterior motives besides truly believing in her agenda and wanting to enact it, is what people told me.
Well, I mean, sometimes we have strong secretaries of education who get a lot done because they have a cooperative Congress or they have a president that's very willing to use the bully pulpit on their behalf. That has not been the case for Betsy DeVos. The Congress has shut down a number of her direct requests related to things like school choice, but she's been very effective at other parts of her agenda. Why do you think that is?
I think Betsy has been most effective in enacting her agenda in areas where she doesn't have to go through other people and she doesn't need public support. For example, she has rescinded a litany of guidance that was put forth by the Obama administration in the Office for Civil Rights. And the Obama administration didn't need to get congressional approval to put forth this guidance, so she could just as easily rescind it. So she's been successful when enacting policy or getting rid of policy that doesn't need to involve other people.
Rebecca, you spoke with Randi Weingarten. She's president of the American Federation of Teachers. She's been a critic of Betsy DeVos, and she expressed what I would characterize as maybe grudging admiration for DeVos's consistency. And the way you framed it, I thought, was really nice, which is you said, she may be a lot of things to people who disagree with her, but she's not a chameleon. Tell us what you mean by that.
I believe when I was talking to Randi about this, she was drawing a contrast between Secretary DeVos and perhaps some of her fellow cabinet officials and Trump administration leaders in the fact that Betsy DeVos doesn't appear to have ulterior motives. She is exactly who she presents to be. And while Randi vehemently disagrees with what Betsy believes in, she believes that Betsy's doing these things because she genuinely believes in it. She doesn't think that Betsy is putting on any type of charade.
We know that Betsy DeVos is a big enthusiast of the free market. How much of that enthusiasm is driving her decision-making?
I would argue that it entirely clouds her worldview in terms of what she thinks is best for education. So obviously, we know that the thing that Betsy seems to care most about is school choice. And school choice is driven by this idea that parents will always and absolutely make the best decisions for their child and therefore should have access to a litany of options when deciding when their child should go, free from government interference, regulation, and even some accountability. And I think what underpins that belief of Betsy's is a belief in the free market, that consumers are the best decision makers. And if something isn't providing a worthy product, then the market will solve for that rather than any type of government institution.
Betsy DeVos is a product of private Christian schools, and her faith is a big part of her identity. You didn't really go into that in your piece. What drove that decision?
I didn't go as far into that because I thought it was harder to look at her specific actions as Secretary of Education and point to religion as drivers for it. I believe that Betsy's interest in education comes from her staunch faith, but I think that her specific decisions while in office perhaps are less driven by that. I actually heard mixed things from people who worked with her in terms of how much she brings up her religion and appears to be motivated by it in her day-to-day life, even though she's clearly an extremely devout person. But also because I felt like that was something that we knew a lot about, that had been discussed a lot already, and I wasn't sure how much more reporting and new reporting I could offer on that front.
So she's a billionaire. She obviously does not need the job for the government paycheck. And she said at EWA's national seminar this past spring that she's not interested in publicity or fame. So what's your takeaway? Why is she doing this?
That's true. She's a billionaire. She doesn't need more money. She doesn't seem to love publicity. The takeaway that I got based on my reporting is that she really cares about these issues. If there is any opportunity for her to spread the gospel of school choice, she will take it. And she wholeheartedly believes that it is so much the right thing that perhaps she will put herself in situations that might be uncomfortable for her, that she doesn't need to do, because she really is really dedicated to this issue.
How do you tackle an analysis piece like this when you know the main character, if you will, won't be talking with you?
Yeah, so I try to talk to as many people in Betsy's orbit as possible to really get a full picture of the person that she is. So I obviously talk to people in the advocacy space, people who supported her, as well as people who have been staunch critics of hers. I talk to people who she worked with at the education department, but I also talk to people who worked with her in previous aspects of her life before she took on this role. I spoke to people who considered her a friend. I spoke to people who went to church with her. So because I didn't think that I would get any direct access to DeVos, I really tried to talk to as many people as possible who didn't know her only as the Secretary of Education, but also knew her as a fully fleshed out human.
Do you get a sense that people are more open to discussing her now than they might have been, maybe the first year of her tenure?
I think perhaps people are a bit more open to talking about her because there was such a firestorm around her when she was confirmed. And, she was clearly being just bombarded with criticism. So I think it has died down a little. A few years later, she is solidly in her role and has shown some consistency. And even though she has been immersed in a litany of bad press over the years, she's by far not the most scandalous member of the Trump administration. So I think people felt a little bit more comfortable letting a reporter in and had a little bit more faith that I wasn't coming to do a hit job on this person that they knew and felt was, a full human who they might like and enjoy spending time with.
Let's say you get Betsy DeVos on the phone. What do you want to ask her?
When her employees, people who worked with her, talk about her decision-making process for things, they paint it in really plain terms. They take pains to emphasize that she's not a bad person, that she really does care about students, and that she really does care about civil rights. It's just that she truly believes in small government and that there should be minimal government interference in students' lives. So maybe we know that that's what she thinks practically, but because they have gone to such lengths to explain the fact that she isn't callous or insensitive. I am curious about how she actually feels about her decisions. Even if she believes it's the right thing, how does it make her feel when she's presented with stories from families and students who may have been negatively harmed by her actions? For example, I spoke with Eliza Bayard, the president of GLSEN, which is a LGBTQ civil rights organization, and she described sitting with Betsy DeVos and other advocates of transgender youth right after that guidance had been rescinded, and really trying to explain to the secretary what this meant for their children, the vulnerability they would now be faced with, the pain in having to explain this to their children. And she said that Betsy was, seemed to understand, but was somewhat robotic in her answers and used that opportunity to promote school choice in a pretty rehearsed way. So we know that she is open to meeting with these people and being faced with the realities of these situations, but we don't know that much about what is really going on in her head.
We're talking with Rebecca Klein of the Huffington Post about her coverage of Betsy DeVos's first 1,000 days in office and federal education policy. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us grow. Rebecca, as you mentioned, some of the regulations she's rolled back, things like protecting transgender students in K-12 schools, scaling back federal civil rights investigations, rolling back Title IX protections for sexual assault survivors. So if a Democrat wins the White House, are those candidates promising to do more than roll forward what's been rolled back? Or are we looking at potentially a completely different approach to the federal role in public education?
So the two candidates who have the most comprehensive education plans so far, I believe, are Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Bernie Sanders. And as you alluded to, they have both promised to reinstate the pieces of guidance that the Trump administration rescinded. They have promised to go a bit further than that, too. They've promised to increase funding for the Office of Civil Rights, which is one of the most powerful parts of the Department of Education, and therefore increase federal presence on these issues. Other than that, as we know, the role of the Department of Education in some ways is somewhat limited when you already have a federal education law like ESSA in place, and so much of it is local and up to the states. So some of the other things they've proposed are much more broad and would need a lot of buy-in from places around the country, are not things that the Department of Education could unilaterally do, like raise teacher pay or triple or quadruple funding for Title I. Those are things that obviously would need congressional approval for one. So there are big promises, but it's unclear what will actually happen if one of these Democrats is elected president.
As a national reporter, you've been paying close attention to the presidential debates. Why should local reporters also be watching?
Unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of education talk at the debates, which is perhaps unsurprising, but so much of what these candidates are talking about are really local issues and not something that the federal government has a ton of power or jurisdiction over. So, for example, school segregation came up in the first debate. That's a local issue. That's not really something the federal government has a ton of control over as it currently stands. So there's a lot of things that they're talking about that I really feel like you can look to your own community and see how things are going and seeing what's possible.
I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about the Education 2020 Coalition. It's a group of nonprofits and foundations and organizations who want to bring education issues from the back burner to the front burner in the presidential cycle. What should local reporters be thinking about when their editors ask them for an education angle on election coverage?
Education 2020 is really trying to emphasize the importance of education as an election issue. And it's been interesting so far because you really haven't heard that much from candidates about education besides proposals for free college and what have you. And at the K through 12 level, something that we've heard time and time again is a proposal or plans to raise teacher pay. And that's been one of the constant refrains on the campaign trail. What I think is so interesting about that is you have these candidates acting as though it's a federal issue when we know that teacher pay is a pretty local issue. So that's something I'm really curious about. I did a piece talking to some teachers about how they felt about those proposals, but I would really be curious about what educators on the ground are thinking when they hear proposals like that, knowing how the teacher pay structure does work.
Also, for local reporters who might be wanting to take some inspiration from your work, you've had a couple of stories that I think are really ripe for following. And that includes one looking at where states are falling short on federal requirements to educate children in foster care. Let's discuss that.
So much of what my reporting has found so far is that not only are they falling short on this issue, but it's because they don't know what they're required to do. So it seems like there's been a real lapse in communication because foster care issues involve so many stakeholders. It involves school districts, it involves public service agencies, it involves actual families. They're not communicating with each other, and therefore there's just so many lapses in implementation. One of the things that is most interesting to me is not only is this not happening, but how is it that people don't even know what is supposed to be happening?
I definitely think that's a timely piece. And we do know that kids in foster care are just not getting a lot of the spotlight with all the pressures that are on schools these days. I do think that's an underserved group, but it's also been underserved maybe by the media.
I agree. When you're a kid, your most natural advocate is your parent. And when you are having difficulties with your family, or maybe not living with your biological parent, or you're going from situation to situation, you really lose so much of that advocacy that could push the issue you're facing into the press.
Rebecca Klein covers national education issues and federal education policy for the Huffington Post. She joined us from her office in New York City. Rebecca, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you so much.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to know more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.